Antarctica. I have to say, if you could see the weather that is out there today in beautiful Bloomington, Indiana, this theme of an ice-cold building game really would feel unappealing. Right now, it would feel like playing something called Bora Bora, or I don't know, a warm place where you can buy a croissant. Oh, very scary. And Antarctica makes it worse by, in fact, setting the game in the coldest place in the world. Antarctica is a Euro game that plays for 2 to 4 players, and it is Euro game in the most Euro gamey sense possible. It has a lot of cool, neat wooden and cardboard pieces, as you can see there. And it is about building resources, acquire more resources, and invest those to get even more stuff. You use a combination of elements from cards that are available at the time, but overall the amount of luck involved is pretty limited. Pretty much as in Euro tradition, it is about planning, making choices in a sort of like limited resource environment to build up an engine that allows you to score points and to win at the end. There's also a theme, a background story, but the game pretty much is a generic game where teams of scientists are trying to increase their presence in Antarctica, drilling for resources, or simply increasing their scientific profile. I said generic in the term, in the sense that of the theme of the backstory is not that important, but in terms of mechanics, of all experience, the game actually is not generic at all. It is a pretty distinctive personality, as I hope it will be clear after I show you how the game works. This is the board of the game. It looks nice enough to me, especially given the theme. It's Antarctica, so you cannot expect the map to be too colorful or too exciting. But for what it is, actually, I find it fairly pleasant. If there is one thing about the map, about the board, though, is that it's a little too small for what you need it for. You're going to put a lot of stuff on the board. You're going to build buildings, bring droves of scientists there, and the map will feel cluttered after a while. A larger map definitely would have been a better choice here. Each player controls pieces of a single color, and you have 3 types of pieces. You have ships that you move around the board to draw, to use resources and to build stuff. Scientists that you use to gain dominance in an area, and then cubes that you use to keep track of your score on the research track, which is that one. Now, at the beginning of the game, players start by placing some of their ships around the board. The map is divided in sectors, and each sector has 3 slots that allow for ships to potentially go there. Also, at the beginning of the game, you set up the game by placing random things on the board. We're placing camps, for example. Then you have some of these 3-dimensional wooden pieces, such as the crane, and then some other b-dimensional. I think it's not b-dimensional, I think it's c-dimensional, but very flat things, for example, like a coastal research center or a naval research center, just to give you a sense. So, and very important, you have the sun that you use to keep track of the turn where the action is, because only where the sun is there to thaw the waters are ships going to be able to move. At the beginning of each turn, you simply move the sun to the next location, moving counterclockwise. And then the ship in the first spot, the closest to the sun, gets to move. So you take the ship and you move it. You have to move it. You can't make it return to the original spot. So it moves to any other sector, and where it moves, it gives you an action. So basically the idea of the turn is you move the sun, whoever gets to go because of the ship is placed there, goes to the next location and takes an action there. So for example, now I would be able to perform an action there, and I'll talk about the actions in a second. If there were multiple ships where you just moved the sun and you moved a ship from, then the remaining ships simply move down and they get closer to the initial position. So as you can see, turn order is very variable. It depends a lot on your actions and the actions of your players, because you may have all of your ships in a single location, repeating something that is related to that area, doing it over and over again. But the problem is that it's going to take a long time before the game goes back to you be able to do all of your actions. In other cases, for example, if I am here, then the green player can move here, and then actually I move the ship there, and then the next turn the ship gets to go again. And maybe I'm sneaky and I keep going to places where no one is, but there will be areas that will be of particular interest. But yes, if you end up in an area that has no other ships in it, then your ship will get to go the next time that the sun comes around. It's a very cool, very neat mechanism. So you take your turn and you perform your action. When your ship, one of your ships gets to move. But what are the actions? A very important action is to build a building. At any time during the game, unless the deck is exhausted, there will be 3 buildings that can be built. There are 3 decks that represent different types of buildings. You shuffle each deck separately, and only the top card of the deck's place faced up is available and visible and available for building it. The top card tells you the kind of resources that you need to have access to, and here at the bottom it tells you the kind of building that you can build thanks to the access of those resources. For example, to be able to build a camp, that is a camp, I need access to these 2 things. That means that I need to have ships parked by those 2 things. So for example, let's have a look. Here we have the red, which is by this one, and red also has one by this other piece here, the Mickey Mouse. So we have Mickey Mouse and bunny ears. So hooray, I meet the requirements for this, for building a camp. So I moved my ship here. There isn't a camp here yet, so I take a camp from the supply of buildings that can be built and I place it there. Each area has different slots of different colors, you can see, of different shape, each for a specific thing. So, right, but you can only place things in areas where there isn't already a one of that kind. There can only be 1 building of a kind in each area. But there are really a lot of buildings. You can have multiple basic places, basic resources. You can have advanced resources such as this one. There are really neat, tall other buildings, advanced buildings such as these ones. A lot of stuff that you can build. Now, I just build the thing, so now I also get to place a scientist there. It's important I get the scientists from my personal supply, which is not all of the scientists that you haven't placed yet. Let's say there is a limbo and you need to perform actions to get the scientists from that limbo to your supply, and then through actions you can place the scientists on the board. And here, the building this allows me to put a scientist there. Then also I get to advance 3 spaces on the research track. So I will simply place a cube on the research track and advance on one of those tracks. Other actions, well, I mentioned the scientists, so you need to recruit them before they're available at all. So if there is a camp in the target area, which is the area you just moved to, then you're able to recruit scientists. So all that happens is that you get scientists from the limbo to your available number, a number that is equal to the number of ships and scientists of your color in the target area. So actually, if I were to move another ship there, say I'm red and I move this other ship here, then I'm able to recruit 3 new scientists because the total of my ships and scientists already there is 3. The more people you have, the more people come. You know, they build it and they'll come, sort of thing. You can also build a ship, but before you do so, somebody needs to build a shipyard. So if you build a shipyard, then this is the shipyard, you can then build ships in that area. That becomes the target area. When you activate it, if you still have available ships, you're able to add ships to your pool. And that is pretty neat because, of course, the more ships you have, the more often you go. The number of initial ships depends on the number of players that are playing, but the more, the better, always. I mentioned earlier research centers, such as that one or that one. If there is a research center in the target area that you just moved to. Another action that you can perform is to activate the research center to advance on the research track. And the number of spaces that you advance on the research track, using little cubes to keep track of that, is equal, again, to the number of scientists and ships that you have in the area. The more people around the research center that you're using, the better. There are various research tracks. When you activate a research center, you advance on the corresponding track, which can be inland, naval, or coastal. Or with more players, there are more tracks that get activated, and you move along those tracks. You can see some boxes are color-coded, and they have symbols in them. Those are simply the advantages that you get when you enter that space. The red spaces represent advantages that when you get there, you get them, but every player that gets there receives that advantage. Blue spaces, on the other hand, only happen once per game when somebody enters there, but every player gets that advantage. Speaking of every player, there is something that is important too, I didn't mention earlier. We talked about building ships. When you build a ship, is a huge advantage, so to balance that, other players also get something. They get a card from this deck, which is a deck of shipyard cards, as you can see from the symbol, and simply there are symbols that represent different types of advantages that you can benefit from when you get a shipyard card. Everybody gets one but the player that just built a ship. Speaking of cards, also these are the cards that are resources, and you can use them to build your buildings. So basically they meet the requirement, they allow you to meet the requirement of the cards that you use to build buildings. So this card, for example, is worth any of these four. And those cards are interesting because they give you a little bit of flexibility so that you can build buildings even though you're not necessarily in the area that otherwise would give you the right resources. Just nice to have that extra flexibility there. So you continue like this. It's really pretty simple. You simply move the sun, everybody well, the person that is first in line takes an action, and the actions, again, just to summarize, are to build a building from one of those decks of cards, build a ship, recruit scientists, or advance on the research track. You may also choose to do nothing, but it's not a particularly smart idea. The game continues like this, with players taking turns, advancing and building stuff, and bringing scientists to the map until either a player has placed all of their scientists on the board, or a player has built the last building that is available. In that case, at that point, the game is over and you score victory points. Scoring is based on majority. Nothing is absolute. Everything is based on ranking and where you are relative to the other players. So there are various areas of scoring, and again, in all of them, you do better if you're better than your opponent, not just good per se. Area scoring is about the player that has the majority of scientists in each area. Now, this is the tricky thing. When you have majority in an area, because you have the majority of scientists, you score a number of points which is equal to the total of buildings and scientists. The second player gets to score the number of scientists of the first player. The third player, the number of scientists of the second player, and so on and so forth. Basically what happens is that in all areas of scoring, the first player will get a lot of stuff, that is his or her own stuff plus extra stuff. The second player will get to score based on the score of the first, the third on the score of the second, and so on and so forth. It's a little unusual, a little counterintuitive, it takes a little bit to get used to, and feels fiddly. So not my favorite area of the game, but once you get it, it's not particularly a particular problem. Research track scoring works in a similar way. First you look at the points, you probably saw those numerical values written on the research track. Those are the points that the cubes in certain positions of the research tracks are worth. So the first player, whose cube is farthest ahead, receives the total victory points of all cubes on the track. Second player, the value of the first player's cube. Third player, the value of the second player's cube, and so on and so forth. Buildings, some of the buildings that you build will have that little star that you see there in the corner, such as this one. Those are worth for scoring, but again, everybody scores their point. Everybody counts their points. You rank them. The first player gets everything, gets the total of all those numbers. Second player victory points based on the second player based on the first, and so on. Resource. Again, in a similar way, but based on the resource cards that the players move to the discard pile. You total all of the points coming from this pretty laborious score system, which I wish had been designed in a slightly more streamlined, friendly way, but nevertheless, you total the points coming from these resources, and at the end of the game, of course, the player with the highest total is the winner. Sometimes a game really needs one good idea to stand out. It needs more than that to be a good game, mind you, because I may have a good idea and then a terrible development around it, or that idea doesn't have mechanics that go around it that really make it shine, and so an idea may be necessary but not sufficient. This is not what happened here. The game revolves around the good idea, which is the idea of the turn of the variable player's turn determined by the going around of the sun, and how of course you can manipulate that, how you can put yourself in several different positions, and you're also trying to figure out what the opponents are going to do to see what's going to be available next. But the fact that you can go a lot in a part of the game, then you may have to wait for a while, but it's your choice, which means if you don't like it, then you only have yourself to blame. Now that aspect of this variable turn and how much flexibility you have there when you're gonna go next, I like very much. To me, it really is what the game revolves around, what gives the game its personality, its unique feel, and so many of the challenges. Because it's not just a matter when you place your ships or deciding when you want to go next. It's balancing where you want to go next, when you want to go next, with where you're going to be and what you want to do with your positions, because you need to have access to resources to build stuff. So there is a certain chain of events that needs to happen. You need to first come up with some basic resources. You may want to need some extra scientists. You may want to maybe need an extra ship. Without many ships, with just the basic ships, it's hard to build big stuff. Then once you have a little bit of a going pool of resources, it's about placing them so you can build interesting stuff and draw more people on the board. And again, it all needs to be done gradually, balancing the fact that certain locations are really good with the fact that maybe going there is going to be terrible for when you're going to go next, and the number of turns that you're gonna play. On the other hand, there may be sequences of actions that allow you to go very often, and they're not very profitable per se, but in that context, in that situation, based on also what the other players are doing, they become more profitable and more interesting. Definitely there is a relative aspect to everything, and I like very much. I wish the scoring was a little more streamlined. I really wouldn't mind if it wasn't so convoluted, but I like the idea the scoring relies all on the idea of majority, all on the idea of nothing is excellent or perfect per se. It is all based on breaking the balance a little bit, tipping the scale towards a little bit, and doing it possibly economically so that you can spread your resources and have a majority in various areas, as opposed to maybe invest enormously in a single area. You have a huge majority there, but then actually that is also actually going to influence the scoring of the other players that can kind of like they can kind of free ride or cheap ride a little bit by taking advantage of other players' huge investments. In that sense, this idea of scoring based on what the player ahead of you has achieved makes sense, but again, I wish there had been a way of doing that didn't feel all that user unfriendly. And the other elements that I don't like very much, which is based on this also, is the rulebook. The rulebook is very short and the game is pretty simple. It's pretty intuitive with the exception of scoring. But the game really is not due justice in the rulebook. I had a hard time figuring out the game. I thought the game was much fiddlier and more complicated than it was. simply because somehow the information was kept somewhat vague. It was spread around in small bits and pieces. It was very hard for me to paste it together. But that being said, if the rulebook doesn't discourage you and the board doesn't discourage you, because as you play it, it'll get pretty cluttered and sometimes a little unwieldy, but not a big deal. If these elements of the production that could have been done better do not discourage you, I believe that here we have a game that is pretty interesting and revolves around a pretty solid engine with some interesting challenges, a lot of interesting options, and some really original ideas that, of course, will result in original gameplay. A gameplay that doesn't feel exactly like something you played before a million times. It has its own personality and its own sets of challenges and rewards. A game that is a Euro game in essence, but pretty far from the idea of multiplayer solo. Yes, you're trying to achieve your objectives. Yes, you're not attacking the opponents. You don't have the card that allows you to throw a bomb and murder the opponents. That'd be interesting. The Wargaming expansion, the terror at the base in Antarctica expansion. But until we got that expansion, it is a game that doesn't have the sort of direct interaction, but it has constant, omnipresent indirect interaction in the fact that everything is worth only relative to what the opponents are doing, what resources they're putting down, and how much presence they have in certain areas or on certain tracks. I enjoyed it. I find it pretty enjoyable. Antarctica is a Euro game in the purest tradition. It is, I was gonna say accessible. It would be such if the rulebook wasn't a little harder than it needs to be, but it is easy. It is definitely reasonable to play for experienced gamers. It is not a heavyweight in any sense. It is a medium weight Euro that definitely has enough reasons of interest to me to be fun to play, and definitely a game that I'm happy to add to my collection. I don't know that it will be the first game that I play when the group decides to play a Euro game, but definitely it is an engaging one and one that is fun to play. Antarctica.